Welcome to SMU's Video Archive series. I'm Carter Murphy, and this afternoon we're talking with Professor John LaPrade, who is Professor Emeritus of Spanish at SMU. I have learned that John's family has a remarkably deep and broad connection with this institution, and I thought, John, we might start there. Your father was in the first class.
That's
first
correct.
Class to graduate from SMU.
Well, the first entering class, although he came here as a transfer from Southwestern in Georgetown, while he was a student still at Southwestern, he came up to visit the new campus before it opened and met President Heyer and told him of his desire to come to SMU, and President Heyer encouraged him to do so. And so he entered in the fall of 1915, and then he graduated in 1917 and went on to get his Bachelor of Divinity degree here in 1919.
I think I had assumed that we took only a freshman class in 1915, but that's obviously not the case.
Apparently not.
We were born as a four-year institution.
As a four-year institution, I suppose. I don't know if there were any transfers into a senior class that year. I'm not sure what the first graduating class was, but I presume it was in 1916, and he was in the second one then in 1917.
Did your father ever talk about the number of students in his classes? They must have been small.
He didn't, not the individual classes, but I remember his remarking on the size of the student body, which I think was something around 700 or so. I can't remember exactly. But he met my mother here. And she was in the class of 1918. She transferred to SMU from Polytechnic in Fort Worth.
She transferred also in her junior year then?
I think she transferred in her, probably in her junior year.
Uh-huh. Your father stayed on, you said, and went to the theology program.
Correct.
Was it a full-fledged divinity school at that time?
I think so. I think apparently it was only a 2-year program, but he received his BD, Bachelor of Divinity degree in 1919, and then immediately entered the ministry.
And served where, John?
Well, he served primarily in the Central Texas Conference. In the beginning, of course, a lot of small churches in small towns. And, well, as a matter of fact, most of his ministry was in rather small towns. He did serve in Fort Worth twice, and he served in Waxahachie, where I attended high school, during the latter part of his career as a minister.
Well, to be a Methodist preacher's kid was an itinerant kind of life, wasn't it?
It was. We moved
3 years or so.
Every 3 to 4 years, usually.
Yes.
I was lucky to be able to be in one place during my entire high school career, because he was a district superintendent in Waxahachie, and that
and could reassign himself.
Well, that was a term of 6 years, so we were there for that long.
Your mother, you said, transferred to SMU. What
Right.
did she study?
She studied English. She studied. I remember she studied Latin, because she used to help my siblings with their Latin lessons, and she became a teacher. Actually, during the time that she was in college, she took time out to teach in order to be able to support herself before she had a degree, actually.
So both your mother and father then were early graduates of SMU.
Right.
And what about your siblings, their children?
Well, my 2 brothers and a sister graduated from SMU, and Two of them are still alive, but all of us lived long enough to become Golden Mustangs and celebrate the 50th anniversary of our graduation. And then I met my wife when I was a student here at SMU in a Spanish class, and we got married right after graduation, and we became Golden Mustangs in 2003, celebrating the 50th anniversary of our graduation and our 50th wedding anniversary.
So there's another generation.
Another generation.
And your children, John?
Our children, we have two sons, and they're both SMU graduates. And hopefully they will come back to celebrate their 50th anniversaries as well.
I said, well, I hope we still have a supply of the proper pins
to
give to people on that occasion.
I should mention my father-in-law, my wife's father.
Yes.
Was also a graduate of SMU. He had 2 degrees, a bachelor's degree and a law degree, and he distinguished himself on the basketball court as well as in the classroom. He was All Southwest Conference 2 years in the late 1920s in basketball.
What was his name, John?
Walter Allison.
Walter Allison.
And he was in the first law school class, actually.
And your wonderful wife, Margaret, whom you say you met in a Spanish class.
Exactly.
What was her maiden name?
Margaret Ann Allison.
Margaret Ann Allison.
Uh-huh.
And she majored in Spanish?
She majored in English and Spanish and history, as a matter of fact. So we shared several Spanish classes in common during our last 2 years.
That's a most remarkable dynasty that the LaPrades and have been in SMU for so long. Let me see. You and Margaret married then at graduation?
Well, we married in the summer, in August, following our graduation at the end of May or early June in 1953.
And then went to graduate school.
Exactly.
And you both went to graduate school.
We both went to graduate school. Margaret only went to graduate school 1 year because our first child was born at the end of that year. And then I was in graduate school for 2 years before I had to go to the Army for 2 years.
Now, where did you go to graduate school then on leaving SMU?
The first year was at Duke in North Carolina.
And you both went to Duke?
We both went to Duke, and then the second year we moved to Chapel Hill, to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
Why did you move to Chapel Hill?
The Department of Romance Languages at Chapel Hill offered the opportunity to teach for graduate students to teach part-time, and they had at that time a much more well-established graduate program with a longer tradition than what they had at Duke at the time.
And Margaret, by that point, had abandoned her graduate studies for the time being.
For the time being, to stay home as a.
But you had only 1 year at North Carolina, then,
right,
John, and the war came along.
Well, it was peacetime, but they still had the draft going.
Well, this was the Korean War.
This was post-Korea. And so I was lucky enough to be drafted and for 2 years, and I was sent to Japan, but I was able to, after being sent over, I was able to send for Margaret and our son, and our second son was actually born in Japan.
Well, I shan't. I was going to ask if you had a chance at Japanese citizenship, but
I suppose he could have, but
yes, perhaps. Yeah. In any case, after a tour of duty with Uncle Sam, you came back then to University of North Carolina.
Correct.
And delved into graduate work again.
Exactly.
And stayed another year or two, I suppose?
Three more years there, from 1957 to 1960.
And then I take it when you left North Carolina, you came to SMU, John.
I did.
And that's a good place to begin the rest of our story.
Okay.
How did you happen to come to SMU?
Well, one of my fellow graduate students at North Carolina when he finished his PhD, he had come to SMU to teach Spanish. He had been here, I think he must have come about 1958 or 59. And he wrote me and told me that they were going to be hiring someone in Spanish. And I really was not planning to leave graduate school at that point, but when the opportunity came up, I wrote my former professor, John Cook, and applied for the job, and almost by return mail, I got an offer to come. And so that was the only job application I ever made.
That also is a good story.
I think things have changed in academia since that time.
Well, you had an inside track.
I guess so.
Had you been a Cook student?
I had been.
Yes.
Both of us, both my wife and I, had been his students.
So this was 1960.
60.
1960. What kind of a department did you find, John?
Well, two people, I think, had just retired, and there were two of us who were brand new, myself and Conchita Wynn. The department consisted of John Cook, who had been head of the department for many years, Robert Royster, who had been one of my teachers and one of Margaret's teachers when we were students here, Donald Fabian, who was the only tenured member of the department other than Dr. Cook. Ed Terry was still here. He was the friend from North Carolina who had invited me to apply. And then there were two or three graduate teaching assistants in the department at that time. And that was about it.
Did Fabian and Terry stay at SMU until retirement?
No. They both left in the early 60s, actually, early to mid 60s. Ed Terry left first, just a year or two after I came here. And Fabian left, I think, about 1965 or 66.
Conchita Wynn, of course, stayed until her death. But that was after her retirement.
That was after her retirement. She stayed until retirement, and then.
What about people like Gene Forrest and Sam Zimmerman, who ran you?
Sam Zimmerman came in 1964. As a matter of fact, I was sent to the meeting of the Modern Language Association to do some recruiting, and I take credit for bringing Sam Zimmerman to SMU, and that was a tremendous asset to our department. Gene Forrest came, I think, in the late 60s or very early 70s, and of course he was also a very valuable addition to our department.
It's a large department. It must have been then, because there was a foreign language requirement of all undergraduates.
There was a foreign language requirement.
And it's probably still a large department. But how many students were there, do you suppose?
It would be hard for me to guess at this point.
Yes, several hundred probably.
A few hundred at least. I can't. I know that we had all of us were teaching 4 classes, and the classes were pretty full. So
those were formidable teaching assignments, weren't they?
They
We
were.
were teaching 12 semester hours.
Right.
Was there a graduate program in the department at that point?
There was. I think there was a graduate program in Spanish from the very beginning of the university. Or if not at the very beginning, very soon, very, very early in the history of the department, there was a graduate program in Spanish, and also in French and in German. And we had, of course, a fairly small enrollment, but enough to justify offering the degree.
Then, sometime in the early 1960s, John, there came the merger of all the foreign languages into what's now the Department of Foreign Language and Literature.
Right.
How did that come about? There must have been some. There must have been some objection to it on the part of some of the faculty.
Well, there was certainly some surprise, I think, if not protest. What happened was, in 1963, John Cook, the chairman of the Spanish department, reached retirement age. And rather than appoint someone to be the new head of Spanish, the provost at that time, who was named Ayers, decided this was
Bill
the time.
Ayers. Mm-hmm.
Bill Ayers, that's correct. He decided this was the time to merge the departments into one. And so he told us that was what was going to happen, and said we could choose our own name. So we decided on the Department of...
the only degree of latitude.
This was our only input, actually. And he appointed Gilbert Jordan, who was chair of German and Italian. Don't ask me about that combination. He appointed him as the first chair of the Department of Foreign Languages and Literatures.
Now, the departments involved were, besides Spanish,
German and Italian, French, and I think by that time the classics department had already disappeared. I believe it was at that time or shortly thereafter that the only Latin that was offered was over the old Tager network, the TV.
Yes, but that was given for primarily people in the technology area.
Yeah, but there were
we did offer them Latin as well.
We did, and later on, I remember we offered Italian over the Tager network.
Very surprising, except for the personality of the wonderful Megan Comini,
right,
who was probably the only person in Italian at that point.
She was, when I came here, she was, I think, the only one.
Who else was prominent in the foreign language area then?
Well, Win Rickey,
I was going to say in French.
In French he was the chair of the French department. And Bob Price was in French. He was here for a number of years during the 60s, and then he left for another position. Doris Davis, who
yes,
was here when I was here as a student, and actually was my French teacher at one time. She was still here. Lon Tinkle had moved out of the French department into comparative literature and then English, but he had been a prominent figure.
I wasn't aware that he had taught French.
Originally, that's what he did at SMU was teach French.
It's too bad we couldn't get him on an archive tape, because he was a wonderful part of the history of SMU.
It would have been fascinating.
The classics. Let's go back to classics for a moment. Classics disappeared. It existed as a program at SMU when I came in 1961.
Right.
There was Latin and there was Greek.
Right.
And was there something else in classical literature? I don't know.
Just Greek and Latin. The classics department for many years had been chaired by Professor Cronin, and there was one other person in the department, I believe, and it apparently was able to exist because of a peculiar set of requirements which allowed students to substitute Latin or Greek for a course in mathematics. And after Professor Cronin retired, the new person hired to head the classics department said that requirement didn't make sense, and he was probably right. So the requirement was abolished, and that in effect abolished the classics department because there were no takers if there only.
Should we have a department of classics, John?
Well,
I rather think we should.
I think we should, and I think, we do. I think now have some classes in Latin, and at least in the theology school, if a student wants to go there, an undergraduate wants to go there to take New Testament Greek, I think they are received with welcome arms. But,
I was sorry to see that program end, but as you say, it drifted away. Foreign language, on the other hand, has survived quite well the end of the language requirement.
It has. We didn't think at the time we were hoping to hold on to the language requirement. We didn't know what would happen, but in spite of that, the languages have survived. I think Spanish has fared better than the rest because enrollments in certain areas tended to drop after the requirement was abolished.
Mm-hmm. Well, Spanish is a popular language in this part of the country.
True.
Where we have lots of Hispanic and Spanish-speaking people. John, let's talk for a minute about the SMU in Spain program.
Okay.
And you were involved in it at least for a while.
Well, I was involved after it had become well established. The program was actually started by Melville Osborne, who was in charge of the Ibero-American Civilization curriculum. And he set the program up to benefit his students more than students of Spanish or for any other reason. But of course it turned into a very popular program for Spanish majors and minors as well as for the student body in general.
I've known dozens of students who thought it was a fabulous experience.
Really, it is, and I think all of the students who have gone to study in Spain have felt that was the highlight of their college career, or to study abroad anywhere. Actually, seems to be the highlight of a college career.
Studying abroad, it does seem to be enormously enlightening and maturing.
Right.
I was in the Oxford program for a number of years, and I think those
that.
students had a wonderful, wonderful time, as did I.
Yeah.
What were the arrangements in Spain? What kind of a program was offered to our students who went?
A faculty, a Spanish faculty was recruited, I think, primarily by Luis Martin of the history department, and he was able to find some young people, some of whom were academics, some of whom were not, to teach our courses, and we tried to offer, of course, a fairly wide variety of courses, including courses in Spanish, courses in art history, courses in history, and then a number of business courses in economics, finance, and other subjects.
How many people from SMU typically went on the year's program?
I think usually between 25 and 30.
How many faculty?
Usually only one. Occasionally there were two, but usually only one SMU faculty who served as resident director, and sometimes taught a course or two in addition to being in charge of the program.
The program, the material was primarily instructed then by Spanish
Correct.
academicians.
Right.
And what kind of, who were those people, John?
Well, one of the most important members of the faculty in Spain was Ramon Buckley, who was the son of a Catalonian mother and a British father, who had been a correspondent for the British press in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. And so Ramon, of course, spoke Spanish and English perfectly, and also was a person with a very sprightly personality, whom the students adored. And so he was in charge of the orientation program for the students, and he was the one who organized the excursions that the whole group took to different spots around Spain, both at the beginning of their visit there and during the course of the semester.
Were these typically weekend trips out
Mostly
of Madrid?
weekend trips, except for the initial trip, which was for about a week usually, just to get everybody sort of oriented to being in a new country.
And well acquainted, I suppose, if you were traveling in a bus.
Exactly, exactly.
By the time you got back to Madrid. What was the teaching facility? Was there a house that SMU acquired, or we shared with others? Or?
Originally, SMU rented space in what came to be known as the Institución de Cooperación Iberoamericana, which was a government agency with a building on the edge of the campus of the University of Madrid. And so we actually rented classroom space from that facility. It was a very good location, being practically on the university campus. And they housed other programs, including a program of Syracuse University. So our students were able to, the SMU students were able to take courses from the Syracuse program and vice versa.
So that broadened the curriculum substantially.
Right.
Yeah, I rather remember that move to that facility and sharing it with someone. It was Syracuse.
Yeah.
The faculty who were there, John, you and I have talked a little bit about Manuel Gala, whom I knew briefly in Spain. And what were you saying?
Well, he was, when I was there, and I guess almost from the very beginning, he was the professor of economics for our group. And not too long after he moved on from our group, I was surprised to learn that he was president of the University of Alcalá, which of course is you don't get there just from teaching part-time for SMU. So we didn't realize at the time what an important figure he was in the academic world in Spain, I think.
And Solana?
Javier Solana, I did not know him, but in the very early days, he was one of the young instructors for the SMU in Spain program. I think he taught what was called the Nature of Man course. And later, when the socialists were elected to power in Spain, he became the Minister of Culture. And from that, he moved on to important positions in the European Union, and is still.
He is now Foreign Minister for the European Union, I believe.
I believe so.
So these were people who were distinguished then and became very distinguished people
Exactly.
who were teaching in the program.
Right.
John, thinking back over the period you have been at SMU, then, first of all, what about the administrators of this institution? Presidents, deans, department chairs?
Well, of course, when I came here, Willis Tate
Willis Tate was president.
Was president, and I think at the time that I came here, SMU was a lot different from the way it is today, because it had a sense, at least, of being smaller then, in that the faculty was very collegial. It seemed like we all knew each other.
Yes.
I remember fondly such people as Neil McFarland, who was provost back in the 1960s, I believe.
And who spoke of academia in a way with which we all could identify.
Exactly, exactly. Certainly, George Zeiss, who was Dean of University College and then in charge of international programs at the time when I worked with the SMU in Spain program, was certainly a very capable administrator who also was a real human being. I don't know, any number of colleagues over the years that came to mean a lot to me.
It's still a wonderful community of which to be a part.
It is. It really is.
Physically on the campus, John, your father was a student. That was, of course, before you were born. But then you and Margaret were students at SMU. This is a long residency, in a sense, for members of your family on the campus. How's the campus physically changed?
Well, of course,
we see it in many ways. We all get lost on the campus these days.
Yeah. When my wife and I were students here, of course, we entered as freshmen in 1949, and there were still a good many veterans of World War II enrolled. And the campus the student body had grown tremendously following
the flood of people back. Yes.
Right. So the campus was filled with temporary buildings, old military barracks buildings and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, my wife and I met in one of those temporary buildings in a Spanish class. It was located right in front of where Fondren Science Building is today. In fact, they were building Fondren Science Building when we were freshmen here. But gradually they got rid of the old temporary buildings and started building the permanent structures that we have today. And we've just about filled up all the vacant land, I think.
Well, yes, we are running out of land, and should, for example, the George Bush Library come to SMU, we'll have to reclaim some land that the university once owned.
I suppose so. That's
the campus changes dramatically. You spoke of the change in collegiality in the faculty and among the faculty and the students.
Well, I think in the 1960s and 1970s, early 1970s at least, there was more of a sense of community among the faculty and perhaps the students as well. But over time, I think the idea of institutional loyalty in the academic professions has tended to wane.
It's a byproduct of our are turned toward research as the primary output that's expected from faculty members, isn't it?
I think it is. When I came here,
so we identify with those who evaluate our research.
Exactly.
Who are our colleagues out in the profession.
Right. When I came here, the emphasis was clearly on the students, on teaching, and that was true, I think, for at least until the mid-'70s, but beginning in the mid-'70s, there was a turn away from that. And I was even told by one colleague at a certain point that it was sheer folly to spend time counseling students. And that disturbed me, and I hope that is not the official.
Well, we have all known colleagues who gave time to their students and who gave time to university affairs, but who failed to get tenure because their research was not
That's true.
Was not adequate to satisfy their colleagues, and that's a sad commentary on modern academic life, I fear.
Yeah.
John, are there other stories we should record?
I'm sure we could stay here.
that should be recorded is another matter, perhaps. We could stay quite some time.
Yeah. I think we've talked about the main things that are important from my early years at SMU. It was, I would have to say that my entire 41 years here, I thoroughly enjoyed every minute of it, and I'm still enjoying it in retirement.
I hope your grandchildren will also attend SMU, John.
That would be great. I'm not sure that they're going to be able to afford it, though.
Our generation has been called the greatest generation for reasons that may or may not be justified. But I think that the generation of which you and I are a part have helped build a great university in the Southwest. And
Well,
it's been exciting to be part of the story.
I think so. And I would want to pay tribute to those who were my teachers at SMU. And there were really some outstanding people like John Cook, Ima Heron, Herb Gambrill. I could go on and on. But those are the people who I think really set SMU apart in the beginning, and I think you and I helped to contribute to continuing what they started.
Well, if we've been able to carry on in a small part that tradition, I would be very pleased. John, thank you for being our guest this afternoon.
Thank you, Carter.
It's been great to put some of this material on the record for the archives of SMU.